of the beautiful things about working at an organization like the CIA is that it makes very clear to you what the boundaries are of intelligence, data, information, and how everyone is always having to operate from imperfect and incomplete data, whether we acknowledge it or not. And one of the ways that we were very concretely trained when we were doing briefings, for example, our customers at the CIA were the president, were senators, were four-star generals, cabinet officials, very senior, the most senior, highest ranking decision makers in US and foreign policy circles. And so we were trained to, and it was drilled into us to say, I don't know. If someone asks you a question, especially with some of the issues that I was working on where the stakes are incredibly high, you don't make up an answer on the spot. You don't waffle your way through it. You say, again, with confident humility, I don't know, but we will find out and come back to you. We don't know, but here are some of the ways that we are looking to fill those gaps in our collection or fill those gaps in our intelligence to help us get a clearer picture. So it's not just throwing your hands up in resignation saying, oh, I don't know, and that this is now your problem. It's a much more empowered acknowledgement of we don't have all the answers, but here's what we're doing to start getting closer to finding those answers.
So hello, Rupal.
Hi.
It's great to finally get a chance to have a chat with you. I know that we met at the Courageous Leaders Conference, which I thought was very fitting that you were a guest keynote there, and we've been trying to get something in the diary. So thank you for your time. By way of intro, I'll just do a little intro on you. So former CIA, two-time CEO, and best-selling author of this wonderful book, From CIA to CEO.
Yeah.
The lessons and unconventional life lessons for thinking bigger, leading better, and being bolder. A book I thoroughly enjoyed, so thank you so much. Full of interesting stories and examples that you bring leadership to life in such an interesting way. And I think your unique and unconventional kind of perspective and how you've brought that kind of CIA tradecraft, if you like, to how you navigate ambiguity, making those bold decisions and leading with authenticity. So thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing some perspectives from you today.
Thank you.
Should we jump in?
Let's do it.
There's so many nuggets of gold that we're going to capture here, but I think, everyone always wants the silver bullet, right? If you were to say one, if there could be one, valuable, the most valuable mindset or leadership principle, I guess, from your CIA experience that perhaps you think leaders today or organizations may be overlooking, what would you say that is?
Gosh, well, this isn't a silver bullet, but it is all encompassing in that I think this approach is valuable everywhere. And it's this concept of confident humility. So being confident that you have the capacity, the capability, the resources, or the infrastructure behind you to achieve and do whatever it is that you set out to do, but also the humility to appreciate that there's only so much that you can control. And this sort of always being fully aware of both is so critical, especially as leaders, for those who are in official leadership positions. Again, that confidence piece comes from knowing that you are there for a reason, right? You've been brought in to lead, to navigate whatever it is, but also being humble enough to know where the boundaries of your expertise are, and therefore where you need to bring in other people who are going to be able to complement and augment where you don't have the skill set or the experience or the expertise. So it's both. I think they're a really beautiful and additive combination. But so often we overcorrect for either the confidence part or the humility part in personal, professional, and various levels of organizations. And so it's the combination of the two that I think is really, really powerful.
Yeah, I was only at a conference last week where we talked about just that piece. And I think we surfaced that as leaders, it can be quite tricky to have that confidence because you have years and years built up your experience, right? It's become part of your identity of who you are, and trading on that and using that, and then trying to hold that almost slightly lightly. In any advice or thoughts on what you've seen and how you've seen that leaders can take practically in terms of how you encourage or emulate this confident humility?
Yeah, I think it's sort of probably very analogous to what you're doing here, right? It's always be willing to learn and always have that openness to every interaction, every conversation, no matter what it is or what you're discussing or what's happening to almost prepare yourself for, I will learn something that I didn't know, or I will have a new insight or a fresh take on things that I might not have had before. Because going into any context really with that sense of openness will therefore make it much more likely that you will see that interaction or experience it in a different way. And so, yes, I think, I often talk about that separation between being all knowing, right? This obsession that we have socially and culturally with expecting leaders to have all the answers. Whereas the reality is that the best leaders are, the way I refer to them, as all growing, right? Willing to learn, willing to stay open, willing to acknowledge that there is something that at every stage of their careers, no matter how senior and experienced, that they are capable and willing to learn.
And I guess that also comes in with the I don't know, or saying,
Mm,
being aware of what you don't know, or
yeah,
stepping into what you don't know.
yeah.
And how did that transpire in the CIA world? Because one would imagine totally, I mean, I know I've read the book, but one would imagine from the outside that that's not an environment where you would say, well, I don't know. Is it you expected to know?
I think one of the beautiful things about working at an organization like the CIA is that it makes very clear to you what the boundaries are of intelligence, data, information, and how everyone is always having to operate from imperfect and incomplete data, whether we acknowledge it or not. And one of the ways that we were very concretely trained when we were doing briefings, for example, our customers at the CIA were the president, were senators, were four-star generals, cabinet officials, very senior, the most senior, highest ranking decision makers in US and foreign policy circles. And so we were trained to, and it was drilled into us to say, I don't know. If someone asks you a question, especially with some of the issues that I was working on where the stakes are incredibly high, you don't make up an answer on the spot. You don't waffle your way through it. You say, again, with confident humility, I don't know, but we will find out and come back to you. We don't know, but here are some of the ways that we are looking to fill those gaps in our collection or fill those gaps in our intelligence to help us get a clearer picture. So it's not just throwing your hands up in resignation saying, oh, I don't know, and that this is now your problem. It's a much more empowered acknowledgement of, we don't have all the answers, but here's what we're doing to start getting closer to finding those answers.
You mentioned that, it's about making decisions with incomplete information, which we talked to many leaders about when they meet to lead, how that can create anxiety. I think with the pace of change, with the world is changing so fast. There's so much complexity, and there's so much misinformation. How do you get comfortable with that? You're saying that they taught you in the CIA that confident humility. I don't know, but in practice, how can leaders kind of build that comfort with discomfort of not knowing, maybe not having all the information?
To be honest, I think it's acknowledging that that's how we've always done things, right? I think so much of what we're seeing in the past sort of decade or so is a lifting of the veil of what we thought previously or experienced previously as being predictable, as being knowable. All of these things were never actually true. They perhaps were truer for longer than they are now, but they weren't always true in every sector of the business or every part of an organization or in every region in which an organization operates. And so for me, fundamentally, it's about accepting this is reality, and it has always been reality. But from a practical perspective for leaders to go back and reflect and think on their own careers and look at all of the evidence of times where they had to make decisions under uncertainty, where they had to navigate ambiguous context, where they did successfully, make a decision even without complete or what they felt was enough information. And every single individual, because they are human beings who have lived through, sort of a few decades of life at this point, will be able to point to very real and very personal case studies effectively of when they had to do that. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate leadership in that we're always looking for an external answer or an external insight. But so often, and especially in the work I do with leaders now, it's about delving into your own lived experience, because that is often what we take for granted, and we don't, mine it enough for the insights and for the expertise or for the experiences that are already there. And so I think it's really that piece about acknowledging what you've already done, because if you don't make the effort to sit down and reflect and capture that, you'll miss the fact that you have already successfully navigated ambiguity in the past, but you never really registered it.
And that's that pausing a lot, isn't it? And stopping and being able to reflect or flex the reflective muscle to capture those points of reference, is
Yeah.
what you're saying. Like they exist, but we don't always take note and arm ourselves with that. And you also mentioned in the book about tactical ignorance, which I quite like that. Just explain a little bit to me, because I think what we've just talked there is about like misinformation, and equally like overwhelm of information, and so much information, so much noise. How do you know actually what information is going to move the needle? How do you identify that? Talk to me a little bit about that piece. Really interesting.
Yeah. So tactical ignorance effectively is about using ignorance as a tactic, right? It's not about like, burying your head in the sand or pretending things are other than they are, but it's about being very intentional about the things that you will ignore. So for most people, as you said, we are all swimming in noise. We are being bombarded by every device, by every sort of in every room, in every conversation with so much input. And what I think is really, really important for leaders to do in order to be able to parse that signal from the noise is a couple of things. One is to, again, reflect back on their own expertise, right? So often the noise we sort of appreciate and might have an instinct for, oh, well, that's not really relevant, but I feel pressured to because everybody else is talking about it or everybody else is focusing on this thing. So therefore, I feel pressured to pay attention, even though I sort of have that instinct that it's not relevant for me, my business, my team, whatever it is. So one is to really rely on that, right? You got to where you were through, again, decades of lived experience, and that counts for something. And that needs to be more regularly tapped into that feeling of intuition and expertise that you have. And it's not about having an intuition about things you are not an expert in, right? I think sometimes we talk about leaders relying on their gut instinct as if it's always a good thing. And my sort of view on that is you can only have an instinct for something that you are actually an expert in, right? You can't develop an instinct for something that's new to you or you're not very experienced in because you don't have that body of experience. And so, but for most leaders, they will have either industry expertise and experience or positional expertise and experience, relational expertise and experience. And so to leverage that and use that as the filter through which they decide, well, actually, yes, given the decades that I've been doing this, what has tended to always be true, right? Yes, things are changing, but human beings are fundamentally the same. And most leadership decisions are about motivating and organizing human behavior. So that's one thing, is relying on your own experience and expertise. And then the second sort of filter for signaling or filtering out the noise is whatever that input that is coming your way. One, is the source of that input qualified to give that input, right? Are you getting marketing advice from someone who's done a brilliant job at marketing, or is it just somebody who has an opinion and you feel the need to take their input in? And secondly, is do they share the same values as your organization or as you as an individual leader? Because if those two things aren't true, then there is no sense in letting that input in, right? If they haven't done it successfully, they don't have the experience and the expertise themselves, and they have a very different way of achieving things than you or your organization are going to do or have the capacity to do, then it's not worth letting in. And so I think again, we can overly intellectualize this idea of, but how do I know? How am I supposed to tell the difference? Well, again, you probably already have an idea. And then secondly, filter out the source of that information and see whether they are qualified and values aligned. And if not, then by all means ignore them, because it's not going to, more likely not that it's going to be relevant.
It brings about, again, that's like surfacing that self-reliance, isn't it, by building your own inner resources. How do you balance that then? What's your thought around what you take in and assessing the validity of that, and then also re-looking at things again and perhaps challenging and questioning assumptions or things that we've always held to be true, to almost spot potential risks or opportunities facing us? What's your thought around how leaders can balance that? Because it is a balance, isn't it? And sometimes they're slightly opposing. It's like, no, I trust my experience here, or what I lean into, what I know, my intuition, whatever my expertise, those sources are credible, versus actually where are trends going and how can I reassess and reach and challenge those assumptions?
Well, and I think you said it exactly right there. It's to again acknowledge what are the boundaries of your experience and expertise and what are your blind spots. I think there's, again, for most of us, and hopefully this is true of leaders, and I imagine it's definitely true of leaders who are listening to this, we'll have a pretty clear understanding of knowing, well, you know what, this is what I'm really good at. And this is where I just don't either have the experience or the bandwidth or the capacity or the interest in being good at it. And therefore, yes, I can't predict trends, but I can understand how I can motivate people once we've decided which trend is relevant for us. Or I don't understand AI, which pretty much nobody does at this point, even now, but I know who the people are that I should be talking to because they are the ones who in the past have successfully navigated through big technological shifts or big, workplace transitions or whatever it is. And so it's that, again, that ability to know what are the boundaries of your expertise, and then therefore being willing to open up the questions and the dialogue with those who have additional expertise that you simply do not have, as opposed to doing what I think has often become romanticized as being that sole decision maker in your own head, keeping your own counsel. There's space for that, but so often what is really, really helpful and is required is to bring in inputs from other qualified, experienced experts in their own field. And often they will be in your own organization, right? You can't make decisions in isolation that affect a very dynamic, matrixed organization if you're only relying on your viewpoint, because it will be so skewed in ways that you won't even realize until you bring in those from legal, compliance, product, marketing, sales, whatever it is, in order to help round out that decision-making process.
So bringing those diversity of inputs in, but and I also think it's inviting that dissent, isn't it? Encouraging that. You talk about how leaders can view failure through a lens of fear and punishment. I guess some organizations still feel like it's not.
Yeah.
You're punished if you don't get it right. So how do you reframe risk and failure in organizational cultures so that teams feel this is a constant thing, right? That teams are empowered and feel safe to speak up and out. That whole thought that we're talking a lot about agility and innovation comes from that. So how do you create that reframing?
Yeah, again, I don't think we need to overcomplicate this. I think a couple of very practical things that leaders can and should do is one, to very openly discuss their own failures when they have gotten it wrong, or, even if it's in the middle of a decision, hey, and just to raise your hand and say, hey, look, I made this decision, I took us in this direction, and actually now we're finding, now that we have data, we've got feedback, we've got, some interaction with the real world conditions, that this was the wrong call. And I'm going to hold up my hand and acknowledge that and take ownership of that. We made the best decision we could at the time, given, again, the incomplete data set we had, but we're now realizing that we need to pivot, and I'm going to acknowledge that that was partly on me, right? So to never pretend or to glaze over or to sort of keep throwing resources after a decision after you've realized it's the wrong one, and not making it such a big deal to acknowledge when you have gotten it wrong. I mean, I think it doesn't have to be this big navel gazing sort of exercise. It can just be like, hey, this is what we did, this is why we did it, and it made sense at the time, but we realized that was the wrong call, so here's how we're going to tweak it, or here's what we're going to do to test a different, way of doing things or a different direction, etc. But to have that conversation and to have it very candidly and very publicly with your team is something that I think, again, everyone is seeing it, everyone's saying it behind your back, so you may as well get ahead of it and again, act like the leader you are and take ownership of whatever is or isn't working. And so that's one practice, is sharing your failures, or maybe even something as simple as, even if it's not relevant and you want to sort of reset the tone of how people perceive risk and failure is, or quote unquote failure, is to talk about times when you've not in that specific context, but in a different context, right? Maybe at your previous organization, some things that you regret or some lessons that you learned from really getting it wrong, but to just rehumanize the way that we approach leadership and make it less about being on a pedestal and keeping people on pedestals, and more about understanding, this is how I got here. Here's some of the biggest mistakes that I made that I learned from, the lessons that sort of fuel the way I show up now. And I'm going to share that with you because I think it's important that we all acknowledge that nobody gets it right all the time. And then that's a very personal accountability way of showing up and inviting failure, or inviting dialogue around failure. But then secondly, it's also to that point around what we reward and what we punish, right? Both explicitly and implicitly in teams. And in organizations, everybody knows what the rules are. There are the rules that are written down on paper and that HR shares with you. And then there are the rules that everyone experiences in day-to-day life. And so we cannot, as leaders, say, hey, we really appreciate, like, we want to be bold and we want to be risk-taking and we want to be, innovative, et cetera. But then anytime somebody raises their hand with a new idea or a different way of doing things, they immediately get slapped down, by the culture. And so it's being very thoughtful about the culture that you create and then actually reinforcing and quote unquote rewarding the behaviors that you want to see propagated throughout the organization instead of saying one thing and then doing the total opposite.
I love that. And, a lot of your book, having read it, it is humanizing again, putting it back to basics, keeping it simple, very real. It's the words, the authenticity that you approach thing, that humble humility that you talked about. But it goes through, I guess, to how you model that, how you talk about it. Like you said, your failures, all the learnings, and how you reward that behavior, whether you allow, you encourage and invite that dissent and challenge, or whether you shut people down. Just talking about that openly. Any other thought on what a practical thing a leader can do to kind of encourage and shift the psychological safety in their team, that feeling of openness?
I mean, it builds on what we just talked about, is what are the structures that are actually in place that are reinforcing behaviors or that are punishing behaviors? Because again, I think so often we've made these conversations so intangible and we've made them up here, but then never translate into actual policy or actual, these are going to be added to your performance reviews, or, the metrics that everybody is also being asked to pay attention to have to reinforce the behaviors and the psychological safety. Otherwise, no one's going to do it, right? Like, I think there has to be an incentive to show up in the way that we want people to show up, because some people will need those incentives and some people will respond more to, okay, well, if you don't sort of come up with new ideas, then it's going to show up on your performance review, or it's going to in some way be measured in a way that is resonant with what we're trying to create in as part of this new culture. So you can't have these cultures and these values just be ideas or slogans. It has to be woven into the leadership development of emerging managers and developed leaders. How are they being rewarded for the way that they are managing their people and creating this culture of inviting innovation and risk taking or failure, however you want to phrase it. And then also, what are in the policies? What is the day-to-day sort of like rules that people are going to look to and say, okay, well, this is how I know that I'm going in the right direction, and these are some of the things that I can be expected to receive and be rewarded for and recognized for if I conform in this way that we want, we as an organization have decided we want people to show up as.
And just building on that as a final point, I get, we talked there about psychological safety and reframing, getting comfortable with incomplete information. Going back to what we were talking about at the beginning as well, is that constant change, so that uncertainty that we're building and the ambiguity that creates. What have you seen with teams whereby what separates those leaders from those that hold their teams together, that keep them really engaged and are communicating well with them, versus those that perhaps lose an element of that or lose their team a little bit in the flux of change?
I think it's the honesty, that willingness to name what is happening and not pretend it is otherwise, not to sort of, be all corporate and toe the line. And I think that's the beauty of all of the things that we're saying, is that even if organizationally this isn't happening in your little pocket of the world, however big or small your team is, you can create these little nodes of change and these cultural shifts and these, again, more openness to risk taking and honesty and authenticity, whatever it is that you find important, you can bring to your part of an organization. And what I've seen both from my work at the CIA, but also in, everything that I've done since, is that when you do that, you create this beautiful self-selection process for the types of people who will then want to join those teams, those higher performing, more collaborative, again, whatever, values and cultures you're creating, people will self-select in because they want to work for leaders who are showing up in that way. And by the same token, it will make your job a lot easier of those who don't sort of align will find another way, right? They'll find a way to go to somewhere where the culture is more in alignment with who they are. Now, you don't want to build 10,000 different cultures across a single organization. But fundamentally, if there's a change that you think is required, then you can start it with your team, whether it's 10,000 or 20 people. And I think that is what I've seen is that the best leaders at every level have been willing to just be really honest about what is going on, who they are as leaders, and what their teams can expect from them, and therefore also what they will be able to want to expect from their teams. And there's this transparency both in words as well as in the subtle behaviors, again, what is rewarded and what is punished, that is completely consistent with how that leader shows up.
And culture is created, like you said, at a team level. One last thing. We always ask this, read to lead. What's one thing that the listeners could take away and action on a Monday morning? Like, what's one thing they could walk into their organization and do? What would it be for you that you feel right now is needed, and one action or behavior, building perhaps on the honesty point? You've said a lot there already, but I just want to leave them with one thing to think about.
Yeah, I'm gonna give them 2. They're both,
Go for it.
uh, really straightforward. One is to go in on a Monday morning and acknowledge what isn't and what is working and what isn't working, and then to have a conversation to reset that. Because so often I think leaders feel locked into a certain way of doing things, or this is how it's always been done, or this is what, is coming at us from the top down. And don't necessarily, even if it's not working, even if it's creating sort of weird dynamics or there's something happening in their team, but they won't address it full on. So having this willingness to say, you know what? Let's all get together. Let's reset from today moving forward what we want to show up as, how we want to work together, create those rules together, and then hold each other accountable to whatever new culture, new way of doing things, or maybe just a acknowledging the elephant in the room and saying, look, I get that this is where we're all at, but here's how we're going to move forward from here. So I think not being afraid to reset what isn't working and go in a new direction or a slightly different direction is something everybody can do. And to be very transparent, very concrete about, here's how I see things. How do you see things? Let's do this together. And then moving forward, we're all sort of buying in from the beginning. And then secondly, and somewhat related to this, but also all of the other things that we've all been talking about, everybody talks about being exhausted, not having enough time, not being able to sort of, work on the business because they're always working in the business. And I fundamentally believe that, especially for those who are managing people at any level of an organization, you need to carve out completely protected, inviolable time to think. And that is to make yourself unavailable. It is to be undistracted, is to shut off all the notifications and the noise coming at you so you can step out for 30 minutes or an hour and just mentally focus on the bigger picture. Because I think that's another thing, as you said at the beginning, the pace of change, or what we feel is the pace of things changing around us, is really fast. But the day-to-day pace actually isn't that fast, right? It's not like we're going from 0 to 100 in the day-to-day functioning of our organizations. And so this constant need to feel like we're firefighting and have to be doing this or have to be having these meetings, I think we can interrupt that pattern and just say, you know what? Every Wednesday from, I don't know, 8:30 to 9, I'm going to close my door and just think about, where are we going? How are we going to get there? What are the bigger picture questions and problems that we're trying to solve? And then therefore have a solid foundation from which to build on in every subsequent team meeting, whatever, you're doing on a regular basis to check in. But I think too many people, too many decision makers and too many leaders are just constantly going without creating that space to stop and reflect, and you're losing so much along the way.
And that thread that I'm sensing from this is taking control, taking responsibility and ownership, whether it's acknowledging what isn't working and knowing that you can always reset, like feel the power and ownership of resetting whenever you feel is needed, to protecting the time, taking that responsibility and owning that, so that you respond and not react, isn't it? That's it. How do you do that? Because sometimes when I take that moment out, I feel this enormous pressure to think and come up with some great thinking. And that in itself can slightly, we're all human, that can feel overwhelming.
It's so funny because I love but having these kinds of conversations, because so many of us operate under this like performance pressure, right? If I take 30 minutes out to think, I have to have a deliverable, right? I have to have something that I can prove that has justified this time. And I think that's part of the problem, right? Because there's not always going to be this very clear, like directional, like, I've thought about this question for X number of hours, therefore I'm going to get this, right? It's a habit that I think is essential just for its own sake. And I know that is not a popular view on most things, but to do something for its own sake, one is its own reward, and and provides its own feedback, because I think just emotionally, right? Everyone feels just frantic. And even if the pace of your life is normal, again, that noise, that feeling that things are happening at pace and that we are out of control and that, we're just this small piece of this much bigger chaotic universe, like that's coming at us all the time. So just taking that 30 minutes, I think for the emotional reset value alone is invaluable. But also, as with most things, the compounding benefit of this is only obvious in the future. So, fine, it might not be in the first 3 weeks that you have this, beautiful aha moment or this like blinding insight. But if you do it consistently for months and then years, over time, you will find that you are thinking clearer. You are able to execute better because, again, you are taking that time out to reflect and be more intentional about how you go back in, and it will build on itself. So you have to commit. This is the problem with so much of conversations around leadership, is that, again, the basics haven't really changed, right? Humans haven't really changed. The way we view the world and interact with each other hasn't really changed. And so we have to be willing to just put in the work and wait for the result instead of feeling like, if by Q4 it doesn't happen, then it wasn't worth it, right? So have patience. I promise you the results will come, but you have to be willing to just put in the work.
It's that dichotomy, isn't it? Or that balance, I guess, struggle slightly, which is take control of your time, give yourself time to think, to reflect, to reset, like own that, acknowledge it, call it out. But then equally within that, there's an element of letting go, isn't there? Which is slightly, feels incongruent, which is letting go in the moment of that time to think and in terms of how you use it and whether there's anything valuable coming out of it. And believe that good will come from that. But it's like you said, over time, it's not always transparent immediately. Rupal, thank you so much. Lots of valuable insights there. Thank you so much for sharing. I thoroughly enjoyed your book, and I'm looking forward to hearing a bit about. Just share a couple of words about your one that you're working on at the minute, your next book.
Yeah. So my next book is tentatively called Powerhouse, and it's looking at the relationship between the skills developed through parenting and professional performance and leadership. And so often when we talk about leadership, again, we make it inaccessible and we make it seem like only certain people with certain inborn traits or, people who are trained in the military or whatever it is have this ability. But the reality is there are so many fundamental leadership skills that human beings develop when they are leading and small humans. And instead of pretending that that's not true, I think it's important that we start acknowledging and seeing how we can make it more adaptable in a workplace context. But fundamentally, every single parent leader that I have spoken to has said, yep, I'm a better negotiator now. I'm better at decision making now. I'm better at trusting my instincts. I'm better at, knowing how to make the trade-offs and acknowledge the trade-offs required of our business decisions. But there's so much insight that we can build on that we bring from home into work. But because we've been all brought up in this cultural obsession with separating work and home and, this idea of like work-life balance as if the two are split in the middle, that's not how it actually works, right? There's so much weaving in both directions. So we should acknowledge that. And my book explores both what are those skills, how are we developing them, both as parents and then adapting them in the workplace, and then has a ton of case studies from executives from, some of the leading brands all over the world around how the direct experience of becoming a parent made them show up at work and be a more effective leader. So I'm very excited.
Love it. It's very inclusive about leadership, and it you're leading yourself, aren't you, as well as leading others, be that your children and leading an organization. They are transferable. It makes you much more well-rounded. So when's the book come out? No pressure, Rupal. Like, what?
I wish I could promise any deadlines, and I'm afraid that I can't. I think at this point it's likely to be 2028, but watch this space. I will definitely keep you posted. Yeah.
Brilliant. So just before we go, where else can people find you in terms of, or follow you, follow your work, keep up to date with you?
The places that I'm most active are on LinkedIn. So you can find me at Rupal Y. Patel on LinkedIn, and I'm the only one with curly hair and the CIA background because there are many Rupal Patels. And then on Instagram, my handle is Rupal Y. Patel.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Rupal, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.